popped up. I'm just going to start with a couple of general points that really occurred to me before Jim and Richard joined me. One is, and I think this is such an obvious thing to say, I don't really need to dwell on it, but it really struck me how almost we have a language problem in conservation. We talk about habitats as if they're one broad thing, like limestone grassland, for example, and yet we heard how at the level at which the species themselves see it and use it, it's all about some much more detailed feature like aspect, sward height, temperature, size of patch, method of ploughing, and all sorts of other things that if you view it the way the animals and the plants would view it, we would probably describe it very differently. And that has tremendous implications for actually what we think the conservation of these habitats actually is. So that might be an issue that we look at in a more general sense. And the other thought I have, which maybe we won't address today, but it's just something that occurred to me, is that a lot of the species we're talking about, which we think of as very rare species, of course, will have been very rare species 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, before many of these habitats even existed, or when they were themselves extremely rare habitats, because so much of it is associated with the last few hundred years of our relationship with the land. So in a way, we're kind of trying to take a very artificial situation, which is now changing in a very artificial way, and to create artificial surrogates to replace that past situation. Now, that's not something that worries us as conservationists, but it is just a sort of an interesting, slightly whimsical thought to take into the conversation. So if Jim Foster and Richard Winspear are available and would like to come and join me on stage, I shall try to pose a few thoughts to begin with, perhaps. Maybe once we've heard from Richard and Jim about how they feel about how their sessions went, and then whether you've got any sort of thoughts or summary that you want to make. So Richard, your session was earlier on today, so perhaps you'd like to begin by summarising some of the thoughts and issues that rose.
Yes, fine. Yes, it was a few hours ago now, and some of you might not have actually been in my session, so I'll just give you a very quick run through. I chaired the Land Management for Species Recovery on farmland. We had a few technical issues at the start, so we were a bit delayed. I think that was code for chairing incompetence in my part, but anyway. We started off eventually with Jennifer Gilbert from Butterfly Conservation, covering grazing management at Rodborough Common near Stroud, working with the National Trust and commoners, and drawing up a grazing compartment plan to restore the slopes for species like Duke of Burgundy fritillary and large blue butterfly, and also the passiflower. And they also undertook a very successful reintroduction of the large blue to Rodborough Common, which is out again this year, so clearly still going strong. And they were able to re-establish juniper on sites by creating scrapes and removing scrub for the Cotswold pennycress. So quite a varied kind of mix of species there. Then Elizabeth Cook from Plant Life talked about colour in the margins, which is the arable plant project, and that involved targeted one-to-one advice to over 150 farmers, which had recently had one of 10 rare arable plants on the land, and they evaluated the advice they gave and found that about 50%, more than 50% of the farmers changed their management, either in minor ways or major ways, following the advice they received from the project. And those that didn't change their management were generally already undertaking suitable management, and the advice they got just reinforced that positive message. So very successful kind of influence on land management, and there are carried out over 70 reintroductions of the species and learned how to modify methods to fit with each of the species biology. Craig Dunton then from Bat Conservation Trust introduced the grey long-eared bat project in South and East Devon, and the habitat requirements in terms of roost, connectivity and foraging habitats. The project focused on landowner engagement and habitat restoration and creation of species-rich, unimproved grassland. They identified issues like gaps in the current Agroenvironment schemes. For example, there's no creation or restoration of species-rich grassland allowed in mid-tier. It's exclusively for higher tier applications, so difficult for some farmers to access. Bex Cartwright then from Bumblebee Conservation Trust talked about the value of face-to-face advisory work and bespoke management recommendations, helping farmers and landowners to identify management interventions that will benefit rare species whilst also supporting their farm business and helping them to achieve other environmental challenges such as soil and crop health and water protection. And actually a common theme through all of the talks really was the inclusion of management to benefit other species in the landscape, which gelled well with the holistic kind of farm wildlife partnership model that we've got to basically support biodiversity on farmland, into which the needs of priority species can all tailor fitted into it. Bex also covered the importance of engaging with farmers to explain the needs of the species present on their farm, so understanding and appreciation is increased, and so they're able to tailor the management appropriately, sometimes in ways that they might sort of uncover themselves. And then finally, Kelly Hemmings from Royal Agricultural University talked about her work helping some of the projects to develop educational resources for higher tier and further education sort of audiences. And so the idea of just writing advisory material for farmers and producing an advisory sheet on everything that you can think of that's relevant, it was a bit of an eye-opener to hear about how Kelly developed whole education packs with lecture notes, presentations, activities and crib sheets, and how in a way she co-designed it with the audiences as well, so that the audiences really did get what they asked for. Was quite inspirational, and really like to consult her on what we've done with farm wildlife and see if there are any tweaks you would recommend to make our resources more helpful. So that was basically a run through my morning session. Lawrence.
Well, thanks very much, Richard. I can immediately think of one or two questions that I would like to ask you, but before I do that, Jim, do you have a similar summary of your session?
Thanks, Lawrence. Yes, so the session that we had was all about land management for species recovery on bare ground. So we were talking about these very early successional stage habitats and the species that depend on them. And there were three things that jumped out at me as being sort of generic across all the talk. All the talks were fantastic, really interesting practical examples, and one at the end about a new project that Plant Life is developing. And I think all of them really pointed to, as I say, three things for me. Firstly, just the critical nature of bare ground for a wide range of threatened taxa. It really is an important habitat that perhaps has been overlooked by some anyway. Secondly, there are lots of different kinds of bare ground. So it's not just, it sounds simple, but actually bare ground can exist in various forms. And we heard a little bit about that, and particularly about how it's maintained in the longer term, the sort of disturbance or management regime that you might put in place to maintain bare ground varies according to which species you want to occur there. And lastly, and I think possibly most critically from my perspective anyway, is we don't really have it right yet. For bare ground, I think is being recognized through projects like this as being important, and yet the existing mechanisms that we have in nature conservation aren't sufficient to ensure that bare ground gets created and then maintained in the right places and at scale. And I think that's a real failing that the sector needs to get to grips with. It occurred to me that there's great work going on, but it's often due to the individual or organizational enthusiasm for doing it, and people are doing it at a small scale locally and sometimes through volunteers. But what we lack is for those outcomes to be properly embedded in and encouraged by the official mechanisms, you know, the SSSI series, the Agroenvironment funding schemes and so on. Yeah, they can all help, but it's not really properly, bare ground creation and maintenance for species is not properly embedded in those yet. And even worse than that, to some extent, some of those systems even dissuaded, because sometimes we heard some examples actually in the discussions earlier that if an organization tries to do certain kinds of bare ground creation, you can create a compliance risk because you go against one of these systems. So I think there's a bit of an overhaul needed there, which would be a really interesting thing to discuss. Back over to you, Lawrence.
Great, thanks very much, Jim. Yeah, definitely loads of things to talk about in a relatively short space of time. I think I'll start by going back actually to you, Richard. And just to ask you this straightforward question, how should farmers take on board the needs of individual species when obviously that's not their core business, and they've got so many other things to consider when they make their land management and business decisions? So how would you advise them to, you know, bring species recovery suitably into their business model?
Yeah. So I think this is really the job of a good advisor, is to lay it out in the context of these other things. I mean, one thing that the whole partnership has been working on behind the scenes has been this farm wildlife model, where we've identified 6 key actions to restore biodiversity, and farmers get to, they can rattle off the 6 things: the flower-rich habitats, the wet features, the connectivity of the field boundaries and margins, and actually the needs of bespoke species in the landscape actually can be tailored. So how you create the flower-rich habitats in a rare arable plant area will be different to how you would create a flower-rich habitats on a heavy clay soil where the only regeneration you like to get is black grass and couch, or barren brome. So basically tailoring how you deliver the 6 key actions to the needs of the species. I think there's a lot to be said for that, because these species are not just flagship species. They are species which are indicators of the unique niche that landscape has. So, you know, rare arable plant areas, there's a long history of arable farming there. The seed bank is ripe for bringing them back, but basically by bringing back the rare arable plants, you bring back all the associated insects and so much of the other wildlife of the landscape as well, because it's been so long since it's been anything other than arable farmland. And at the end of the day, my experience is that farmers are innately interested in rare species on their farm and are very willing to help and very willing to learn. You know, that I got them very excited about stone coolers when I was working on Salisbury Plain area, to the extent that it was very difficult to get them interested in anything else. So you basically, you engage their interest as soon as you say you've got something really special.
Something special have to be something like a stone curlew, or could it be something like a lower plant that, as we were discussing yesterday, doesn't traditionally sort of hit the headlines?
Yeah, some will provide more challenges than others, I suspect. But you know, to be honest, I got farmers interested in shepherd's needle. Having, you know, 30 years ago, the last thing they would want to have on their farm is shepherd's needle. But they just appreciate knowledge of things on their farm that they knew nothing about. Stone coolers, they generally shepherd's needle, they probably tried to forget.
Great. Well, Jim, one of the things that occurred to me, mainly during the bare plant part of the bare ground part of the day, but the rest of it as well to some extent, is the sheer scale of variety of species that we're dealing with. And as most people on this call will probably know, we're primarily driven by the so-called Section 41 list of priority species. What's your feeling about the scale of the task for bare ground species? You know, are we just, well, scratching the surface is probably a little too much of an unintended Freudian slip there, but yeah, are we just scratching the surface when it comes to the priorities? And if so, you know, how can all that variety become mainstreamed enough to cover potentially all the priority species that we have in the bare ground landscape?
Yeah, that's a good question, Lawrence. I mean, there is some work that's been done on this topic. So there was a very nice analysis that Natural England did. I referred to it in the introduction to the afternoon session about 10 years ago. I mean, that could probably be updated, but I suspect the results would still be pretty similar. And that did show that bare ground was very important for a wide range of taxa, a large number of species and a wide range of taxa. My recollection is that bare ground seemed to be more important for certain habitat types, such as grasslands. Just trying to remember the report now, but anyway, that's a useful bit of evidence. I think another nice bit of evidence we've got is the work that Alistair spoke about in that session, which is the project that Plant Life have just been working on with Natural England and others, creating spaces for species project. But as you hint, I think there's probably even more that we could do to explore the value of bare ground for species recovery. I'd temper that by saying that overall, the amount of effort into doing those sort of in-depth research projects is probably not as great as the effort we should be putting into trying to just get the actions happening on the ground and getting the systems in place that will support those actions on the ground. That would be my sort of slight tempering of more research into the ecology issues.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to read out what I think is a response to that from Phil Grice, and also a comment from Howard Eason. Howard says, I imagine that for farmers and growers, this would be a bit of a rethink on the importance of bare ground, because the message is often around reducing erosion, poaching, and balancing this with productivity, and being penalised when land is not covered, as in the current HLS grants. So maybe this should be redressed in the ELMS schemes with a specific focus. And Phil is saying the development of ELMS and the phase out of the basic payment scheme provides us with a great opportunity to mainstream the provision of bare ground into conservation and even farm management. It's crucial that the folk in Natural England develop the options and writing the guidance, have the evidence and best practice available. So two really great observations there from Howard and Phil. And I guess you two would probably agree with that, Richard.
Yeah, well, one of the things that springs to my mind is we have to be a bit careful about the language. So bare ground to an arable farmer is very different to what ecologists value. Yeah, basically, you could argue that the stale seabeds that they create for prior to drilling crops are the wrong kind of bare ground from an ecologist perspective, but so we have to be careful about how we describe bare ground habitats, and obviously bare ground in the context of the other habitat requirements of the ecosystem. But there also are challenging, conflicting objectives that I think what we have to do is make sure the complexity of it is dealt with between government agencies and advisors, and not given to the farmer, as it were. So the farmer gets a very, very sort of simple way in which they can incorporate exactly what biodiversity needs into their farming system through a very well structured agroenvironment scheme. But we at the sort of statutory agency and advisor level need to work through those complexities of challenges, like, you know, ploughing for rare arable plants might be totally against what a farmer who's looking to do minimum tillage for soil management and carbon reasons might want to do. You know, where are the fixes that allows them to basically get good soil organic matter and rare arable plant conservation? How do we design that kind of bare ground management? So yeah, there's a few complexities we need to work through without confusing the farmers.
And is that about just, you know, doing more of this, of the sort of applied science to inform this? You know, are there enough, for example, is there enough academic resource going into answering those sorts of questions, where that balance should lie, how you find the optimum balance, or is it more of a sort of practitioners, you know, based on practical experience of people that go out there and get their wellies dirty?
Well, I think it's definitely a combination of both of those things. You know, we can readily trial things at Hope Farm if there are potential solutions that we could test out, and likewise, you know, yeah, ecological nous. To my mind, you know, a lot of expert thinking from ecologists is just as valuable as peer-reviewed evidence when it comes to working through solutions and at least coming up with solutions that we could test. Yeah, and also to some degree some flexibility about you know getting the right management in the right place at the right scale. It might be that we just need a degree of flexibility about how and where farmers can apply it, built into schemes.
And Jim, I think you want to come in there.
Yeah, thanks. I agree with everything Richard said there, and I'd just like to reflect on what Phil said in the question. I think he's right on the money there, that you know, there is a fantastic opportunity now with the new agroenvironment schemes being designed, and I think Phil's point about making sure that the folks, especially in Natural England, who are going to be involved in producing the guidance, have access to the experience and evidence that we generate through projects like Back from the Brink. And it would be really good, I think, to reflect on where things haven't worked quite so well in the past with HLS and CS, where I think, or certainly from an ARC perspective, we can certainly point to where we've really struggled to get our particular needs for species delivered because of the sort of strictures of the schemes that we're working in. And I suspect it'll be the same for the other organisations, particularly those organisations who own and manage land. So that, yeah, totally agree with Phil. There's a great opportunity to try and make things work better there.
Great, and thanks for those questions. Keep the points coming in. If anybody else wants to raise any issues or perhaps even challenge anything that you've heard in the conversation so far. I was struck by I think it was Sophie talking about the Dorset Heath and the marsh club moss, and the thing that was a revelation to me and probably to all of us was how the marsh club moss, just as one example, exists in very close association in an obligate way with a particular fungus. So my question isn't about marsh club moss. It's about really how reliant do you think species recovery in either the agricultural environment or in the sort of recreated bare ground situation, how reliant do you think we are on having that level of amazing forensic detail of the scientific, the ecology of the species? And should we be looking to continually build that level of detailed information so that we can continually tweak and update the prescriptions, whether it's on a conservation site or a farm, which for dozens of species is going to be a mammoth undertaking and a huge scientific need. Where does the balance lie between that level of real sort of crystalline management and the science to underpin it versus, say, getting a machine out on site, creating a bit of disturbance, seeing what happens and learning that way? Partly a resource issue, partly a sort of practicality issue. Any thoughts from either of you on that?
I could say something. I think, it's a bit of a cop-out, but I think you do need both approaches. You need some sound science, some sound evidence to understand what can drive species recovery, not least because for some species there may be something so fundamental that you can only really find out through some targeted research. And I guess, there are some good examples: Purbeck mason wasp, large blue butterfly. They both have really complex life cycles that involve these interesting interactions with other taxa. And unless we understand what's happening there, it's difficult to really plan a recovery journey and all the steps you need for those species, I would suggest. However, just to slightly contradict myself, and I think some sort of just experimental approaches where or messy approaches where you just go out and try a range of interventions and see what works, there's still quite a lot going for that. And I think there was a question or a comment in an earlier discussion that we didn't have a chance to read out from David Heaver, actually, who was really recommending that approach, that you just go and try a load of things without necessarily knowing what the end result is going to be, but you may well happen across some happy accidents where you get, you learn about what works for different species. And so I do think that we probably need a blended approach there, and I would guard against only progressing species recovery where you've got sort of 10 PhDs and 20 peer-reviewed papers published before you can actually put something into action. I think we do need to try and progress with action at the same time as doing some ecological research.
Yeah, and Richard, kind of following directly on from that, I think we've got a comment from Bill Cove, who says that the complex nature of bare ground and what we all think differently about it will be difficult to get over to farmers who, if they're looking to achieve or receive payments by results through ELMS. So that would seem to be a bit of a challenge, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Hello, Bill. Yes. That again, it comes down to this sort of, let's try and manage through the complexities at the sort of agency end of the spectrum and work through some solutions towards that. And following on from what Jim was saying, I think, yes, those kind of approaches where we try all different things and see what works, I think that's certainly worth doing at a sort of organizational level. So basically, trial and demonstration sites where we can do these trials and demonstrations from which everyone can learn, rather than necessarily everyone sort of having to reinvent the wheel and suck it and see on their own land, which might have limited transferability elsewhere. So it'd be really good to have those as well designed kind of trials, and we learn results from them that can then be sort of disseminated in the same way as like the peer-reviewed evidence and all of that as well. And
Sophie, who's obviously still on the call, has made a really interesting point about the sort of club moss and similar sorts of partnerships, where she's saying that it depends how degraded the habitat has become and how much is left. The more there is and the better condition it is, the less likely we are to run into problems like the lack of an obligate partner, whether it's the fungi for the club moss or ants for the large blue butterfly, and so on. But still room for experimentation, as she says. I want to move to a slightly different look, really, at this, and that is, we've talked quite a bit about farmers and farming systems, but what about the kind of culture of conservationists themselves? You know, the attitudes that we have within conservationists. Do we need to change? And I was struck by a couple of observations earlier today where people talked about, you know, tracks, car parks. I think in the past we've talked about maybe, you know, bringing mountain biking onto the heaths as a leisure activity, because it also helps create bare ground. So, you know, are there possibly ways in which we can rethink for the, you know, sort of 21st century ways of using the land, which are not necessarily driven by a conservation need or a farming need, but there's actually still a need out there, like you need to park your car somewhere, you need to find a place to put your mountain bike. How resistant do you think we need to be, or to that sort of, or open do we need to be to that sort of idea? And are some of these concepts actually challenging the way conservation thinks about itself? Would either of you want to respond to that?
I'll have a go. That's an interesting question there you've posed, Lawrence. I think it really relates to how likely it is those new ways of operating would help us get to the objective for species. I think that's the key thing. If we've got an outcome that we've set for species recovery, I'm all for trying different methods to help us to get there, as long as there's some sort of sensible rationale that, you know, it's not going to completely ruin things and it might help. Then let's be creative. And I think as long as we've got that end game in sight, that outcome for the species, and we have some way to measure progress towards that outcome, then I'm all for trying different ways of getting there.
Yes, I guess it comes down to, you know, the frequency of disturbance and the side effects of that human disturbance element. You'd probably have to engineer it quite carefully. I mean, sort of rotational areas open to bikers and whatever to create the right kind of bare ground in, and yeah, not have it overly disturbed and compacted for species to benefit from. But, yeah.
Or maybe a time limited thing, like, you know, a weekend devoted to it or something. Jane Sears, who we heard from earlier on the field cricket project, makes the point that site staff are often reluctant to allow dirt bikes just because they're hard to control once they get onto a site, which I suspect is said with feeling.
Well, yes, in the agricultural sphere, there's a phenomenon known as mob grazing, where you basically blitz a grassland for a short period of time with a lot of stock, and actually the long-term consequences of that are actually quite beneficial for the soil, the biota, and everything else. And it's not a stocking rate that you would recommend in an agri-environment scheme generally, but mob grazing is a known way of sort of actually getting good grassland management and good soil management from heavy stocking for very short periods of time, and something akin to that for bare ground creation might actually have legs.
Yeah, and probably not unlike some of the sort of microhabitats that you see in places like, you know, the areas that still practice transhumance in dry countries like Spain, for example. So quite interesting there. Sophie, I think it was, who's come back to us on mountain bikes, just to say often the obstacle is as much about health and safety and insurance rather than enthusiasm, which sadly is one of those conservation challenges that crops up all the time, and we all throw our hands up and say health and safety. But yeah, absolutely. I wonder, Richard and Jim, sorry, I'm slightly springing you on this and also a bit of a cop-out, but we've got about 7 or so minutes left. whether you feel, having listened to all the conversations that we had today, whether your thinking has, whether anything that we've heard today has influenced your thinking personally in your roles going forward. Anything that I really have sprung this on you, so I apologise. But so I'm going to waffle a bit while you think about the answer to this question. But yeah, anything that as a result of these conversations today is slightly changing your perspective on some of these challenges?
Just to buy Jim a little bit of extra time, I was just struck by James Sears's last comment about using no visible fencing to mob grazing. If you applied that to bikers, I just had this vision of electrocuting bikers who went off the set area designated one. But yeah,
we'll take that as an action, Jane.
Well, to be honest, the one thing that I took from today was from my session was the very creative nature of designing the sort of educational resources, which could be transferable to advisory materials that these projects are generating, and how actually we might not simply be focusing purely on the technical detail of what we want farmers to do and how we want them to do it, but actually putting more thought into actually the nature of resources we provide farmers and some of their advisors with to really make them the most helpful resources possible to get the right messages across. That was the one thing that stood out to me. I learned today.
Yeah.
I think one thing that I've learned a lot more about is just some of the practical difficulties with implementing some of these management regimes that we've been talking about for bare ground creation. So we heard from Pip, for example, at Natural England, who's been working on the Shifting Sands project in the Brecks, about the challenges that they face with buried ordnance, unexploded ordnance, and the vagaries of working with rabbits when you've got a epidemic disease going on with the rabbits disappearing, and various other practical difficulties that the speakers had found. Sophie, for example, Sophie Lake was talking about the Back from the Brink work in the Dorset's Heathland Heart project, where in order to create some of the bare ground scrapes, there were issues for some of the landowning organisations if they have members, because it looks messy and it might be it might be quite difficult for some of those organisations to countenance undertaking management which looks so dramatic and potentially so harmful. And it just made me reflect a little bit on how to respond to that, and whether before and after photos is enough. Maybe we need before, immediately after, and then 5 or 10 years after to show how the habitats recover, and how this and with data obviously to show how the species improve in status too. So I think there were lots of points in the discussions that made me think, I hadn't quite grasped that before. Maybe nothing that really changed my views 180 degrees, but certainly lots of interesting perspectives I hadn't quite considered before.
And possibly the last question for this session to each of you. We're obviously at a time of great change in terms of the sort of the funding landscape, the policy landscape for conservation going forward. And today we've been talking about some of the biggest, most intractable and exciting conservation challenges. So I just wonder, right now, are you feeling more or less optimistic about the direction of travel as we go forward into the sort of new arrangements for conservation, both in terms of sort of policy and practice? Is it feeling just as hopeless as it always has, or is that a leading question?
I'm cautiously optimistic because I think there's a whole suite of tools that we have or will have available in the next couple of years that potentially could resolve a lot of these structural problems that we have in species conservation. So we've got the new Agroenvironment scheme in England, as has already been mentioned, and that's being designed as we speak. We've got the Environment Bill with its species target, fantastic opportunity to set something in law about recovery for species. We've got the successor to Biodiversity 2020, which from my personal perspective was a bit of a damp squib when it came to species recovery, but let's fix that. And there's thinking going on at the moment on that in Natural England and DEFRA. We've got the learning from Back from the Brink. We've got a whole range of things that are just happening or will be happening shortly, where if we just reflect on the learning we've got, I think we can actually have some really nice sharp tools for species recovery in the future. Arguably, there's some political will. We've seen various announcements, the 30 by 30 announcement and so on. We obviously need the resourcing behind it, obviously, to make it all happen. But yeah, I am cautiously optimistic. Thanks, Lawrence.
Yeah, and I think I think we've got a massive opportunity. We've got a wealth of ecological knowledge and understanding and management solutions to a lot of the challenges that biodiversity faces on farmland and with bare ground. It's just whether we will be able to realise that opportunity, and whether the policy framework will allow it, because fundamentally, British wildlife, I don't think there's any wildlife on the planet better understood than British wildlife. Let's tap into that knowledge and expertise and get these solutions into a very practical, very clear, and very easily manageable opportunity for farmers.
Fantastic, both of you. Thank you very much for those contributions and for your chairing of some great sessions today, and to all the contributors today who really have made this a fantastic second day of our conference.